"Here, sir," said Squeers, with a triumphant air, as Master Wackford wiped his eyes with the cuff of his jacket. "There's oiliness." "He looks well, indeed," returned Ralph, who, for some purposes of his own, seemed desirous to conciliate the schoolmaster. "But how is Mrs. Squeers, and how are you?" "Mrs. Squeers, sir," replied the proprietor of Dotheboys, "is as she always is, a mother to them lads, and a blessing, and a comfort, and a joy to all them as knows her. One of our boys, gorging hisself with victuals, and then turning in that's their way got a abscess on him last week. To see how she operated upon him with a penknife, oh Lor!" said Squeers, heaving a sigh and nodding his head a great many times, "what a member of society that woman is!" Mr. Squeers indulged in a retrospective look, for some quarter of a minute, as if this allusion to his lady's excellences had naturally led his mind to the peaceful village of Dotheboys near Greta Bridge, in Yorkshire, and then looked at Ralph, as if waiting for him to say something. "Have you quite recovered that scoundrel's attack?" asked Ralph. "I've only just done it, if I've done it now," replied Squeers. "I was one blessed bruise, sir," said Squeers, touching first the roots of his hair, and then the toes of his boots, "from here to there. Vinegar and brown paper, from morning to night. I suppose there was a matter of half a ream of brown paper stuck upon me from first to last. As I laid all of a heap in our kitchen, plastered all over, you might have thought I was a large brown paper parcel, chock full of nothing but groans. Did I groan loud, Wackford, or did I groan soft?" asked Mr. Squeers, appealing to his son. "Loud," replied Wackford. "Was the boys sorry to see me in such a dreadful condition, Wackford, or was they glad?" asked Mr. Squeers in a sentimental manner. "Eh?" cried Squeers, turning sharp round. "Sorry," rejoined his son. "Oh!" said Squeers, catching him a smart box on the ear, "then take your hands out of your pockets, and don't stammer when you're asked a question. Hold your noise, sir, in a gentleman's office, or I'll run away from my family, and never come back any more, and then what would become of all them precious and forlorn lads as would be let loose on the world, without their best friend at their elbers?" "Were you obliged to have medical attendance?" inquired Ralph. "Ay, was I," rejoined Squeers, "and a precious bill the medical attendant brought in too. But I paid it though." Ralph elevated his eyebrows in a manner which might be expressive of either sympathy or astonishment, just as the beholder was pleased to take it. "Yes, I paid it, every farthing," replied Squeers, who seemed to know the man he had to deal with, too well to suppose that any blinking of the question would induce him to subscribe towards the expenses. "I wasn't out of pocket by it after all, either." "No," said Ralph. "Not a halfpenny," replied Squeers. "The fact is, we have only one extra with our boys, and that is for doctors, when required, and not then unless we're sure of our customers, do you see?" "I understand," said Ralph. "Very good," rejoined Squeers. "Then, after my bill was run up, we picked out 5 little boys, sons of small tradesmen, as was sure pay, that had never had the scarlet fever, and we sent one to a cottage where they'd got it, and he took it, and then we put the 4 others to sleep with him, and they took it, and then the doctor came and attended 'em once all round, and we divided my total among 'em, and added it on to their little bills, and the parents paid it. Ha! Ha! Ha!" "And a good plan too," said Ralph, eyeing the schoolmaster stealthily. "I believe you," rejoined Squeers. "We always do it. Why, when Mrs. Squeers was brought to bed with little Wackford here, we ran the whooping cough through half a dozen boys, and charged her expenses among 'em, monthly nurse included. Ha! Ha! Ha!" Ralph never laughed, but on this occasion he produced the nearest approach to it that he could, and waiting until Mr. Squeers had enjoyed the professional joke to his heart's content, inquired what had brought him to town. "Some bothering law business," replied Squeers, scratching his head, "connected with an action, for what they call neglect of a boy. I don't know what they would have. He had as good grazing, that boy had, as there is about us." Ralph looked as if he did not quite understand the observation. "Grazing," said Squeers, raising his voice, under the impression that as Ralph failed to comprehend him, he must be deaf. "When a boy gets weak and ill, and don't relish his meals, we give him a change of diet. Turn him out for an hour or so every day, into a neighbour's turnip field, or sometimes, if it's a delicate case, a turnip field and a piece of carrots, alternately, and let him eat as many as he likes. There an't better land in the country than this perverse lad grazed on, and yet he goes and catches cold and indigestion and what not, and then his friends brings a lawsuit against me. Now you'd hardly suppose," added Squeers, moving in his chair with the impatience of an ill-used man, "that people's ingratitude would carry them quite as far as that, would you?" "A hard case indeed," observed Ralph. "You don't say more than the truth when you say that," replied Squeers. "I don't suppose there's a man going as possesses the fondness for youth that I do. There's youth to the amount of £800 a year at Dotheboys Hall at this present time. I'd take £1600 worth if I could get 'em, and be as fond of every individual £20 among 'em as nothing should equal it." "Are you stopping at your old quarters?" asked Ralph. "Yes, we are at the Saracen," replied Squeers, "and as it don't want very long to the end of the half year, we shall continny to stop there till I've collected the money, and some new boys too, I hope. I've brought little Wackford up, on purpose to show to parents and guardians. I shall put him in the advertisement this time. Look at that boy, himself a pupil, why he's a miracle of high feeding, that boy is." "I should like to have a word with you," said Ralph, who had both spoken and listened mechanically for some time, and seemed to have been thinking. "As many words as you like, sir," rejoined Squeers. "Wackford, you go and play in the back office, and don't move about too much, or you'll get thin, and that won't do. You haven't got such a thing as twopence, Mr. Nickleby, have you?" said Squeers, rattling a bunch of keys in his coat pocket, and muttering something about its being all silver. "I think I have," said Ralph, very slowly, and producing, after much rummaging in an old drawer, a penny, a halfpenny, and 2 farthings. "Thankee," said Squeers, bestowing it upon his son. "Here, you go and buy a tart. Mr. Nickleby's man will show you where, and mind you buy a rich one. Pastry," added Squeers, closing the door on Master Wackford, "makes his flesh shine a good deal, and parents thinks that's a healthy sign." With this explanation, and a peculiarly knowing look to eke it out, Mr. Squeers moved his chair so as to bring himself opposite to Ralph Nickleby at no great distance off, and having planted it to his entire satisfaction, sat down. "Attend to me," said Ralph, bending forward a little. Squeers nodded. "I am not to suppose," said Ralph, "that you are dolt enough to forgive or forget, very readily, the violence that was committed upon you, or the exposure which accompanied it?" "Devil a bit," replied Squeers, tartly. "Or to lose an opportunity of repaying it with interest, if you could get one?" said Ralph. "Show me one and try," rejoined Squeers. "Some such object it was that induced you to call on me?" said Ralph, raising his eyes to the schoolmaster's face. "No, I don't know about that," replied Squeers. "I thought that if it was in your power to make me, besides the trifle of money you sent, any compensation—" "Ah!" cried Ralph, interrupting him, "you needn't go on." After a long pause, during which Ralph appeared absorbed in contemplation, he again broke silence by asking, "Who is this boy that he took with him?" Squeers stated his name. "Was he young or old, healthy or sick, tractable or rebellious? Speak out, man," retorted Ralph. "Why, he wasn't young," answered Squeers. "That is, not young for a boy, you know." "That is, he was not a boy at all, I suppose," interrupted Ralph. "Well," returned Squeers, briskly, as if he felt relieved by the suggestion, "he might have been nigh 20. He wouldn't seem so old, though, to them as didn't know him, for he was a little wanting here," touching his forehead. "Nobody at home, you know, if you knocked ever so often." "And you did knock pretty often, I dare say," muttered Ralph. "Pretty well," returned Squeers with a grin. "When you wrote to acknowledge the receipt of this trifle of money, as you call it," said Ralph, "you told me his friends had deserted him long ago, and that you had not the faintest clue or trace to tell you who he was. Is that the truth?" "It is, worse luck," replied Squeers, becoming more and more easy and familiar in his manner, as Ralph pursued his inquiries with the less reserve. "It's 14 years ago, by the entry in my book, since a strange man brought him to my place, one autumn night, and left him there, paying £5 5 for his first quarter in advance. He might have been 5 or 6 year old at that time, not more." "What more do you know about him?" demanded Ralph. "Devilish little, I am sorry to say," replied Squeers. "The money was paid for some 6 or 8 year, and then it stopped. He had given an address in London, had this chap, but when it came to the point, of course nobody knowed anything about him. So I kept the lad out of " "Charity?" suggested Ralph dryly. "Charity, to be sure," returned Squeers, rubbing his knees. "And when he begins to be useful in a certain sort of way, this young scoundrel of a Nickleby comes and carries him off. But the most vexatious and aggravating part of the whole affair is," said Squeers, dropping his voice, and drawing his chair still closer to Ralph, "that some questions have been asked about him at last. Not of me, but, in a roundabout sort of way, of people in our village. So, that just when I might have had all arrears paid up, perhaps, who knows, such things have happened in our